Hi, I'd like to briefly present a paper we published last year on being the victim versus being an observer of intimate partner violence in virtual reality. This study was based on a previous study also from our group who used offenders, so men who actually had abused their intimate partner and who had been convicted for doing so. And the study design is quite similar. So I'll first show you a video which will show a participant wearing a head-mounted display, and he was being filmed while he was experiencing this virtual reality or VR scene. And then on the left side of the screen, you will see what the participant was actually seeing through each of his eyes. I'd like you to pay attention, especially to the behavior of the participant and see how he is reacting in real life to what's happening in VR. And also notice how at some point he looks to his left and he sees a mirror. And in the mirror, he sees the reflection of a woman. Okay, whenever he looked down to where his real body would be, he would also see the body of a woman. That's not shown in the video. Okay, so this man and all participants in this previous study, they were embodying a woman who was being a victim of verbal abuse. You can see the link here on the top to the video on YouTube. Well, I don't know if you really heard what he was saying. The conversation was in Spanish because this study was done in Spain. Okay, so here are some of the results of this previous study. You can see the publication by Sophia Seinfeld and the rest of the group. I'm not going to go into detail, but I think this is a useful background to where we're headed with this presentation. So pretty much in this study, they found that offenders improved their recognition of fear in females, which we can see here in panel A, that's the red bar, and decrease their bias towards classifying fear and anger expressions as happy, which are the red bars here. Notice that we're not comparing here controls and offenders. This is before VR post VR minus before VR. Okay, so that's the change after being the victim in virtual reality to a scene of abuse. And so what we were interested in is the mechanism. So how does this happen? And one of the ways we thought we could start was by analyzing what would happen if we experience exactly the same scene, either from the victim's perspective, so that would be the first person perspective, or as an observer outside of this couple, so as a third person perspective. And this is the paper. You can find it. It was published in 2020, last year. So the aims of this study was to compare the responses and feedback of men without a history of violence. Okay, so here we're looking for the mechanisms, and we did not assess offenders. And half of the men were in the victim's shoes, and then the other half of the men were merely observers. This is what the study design looks like. Here in panel A, we can see how we had this IAT before VR, or implicit association test. This is a test to assess the gender implicit bias. So whether participants have an implicit automatic bias towards men or towards women. And then we had this VR scene where we filmed the participant while they were in VR. So we analyzed their behavior, and we also analyzed their physiology, like the skin conductance response. And here on the right, we see the tests we ran after the VR experience. So the implicit association test post VR, and we also had a questionnaire and an interview. And here in the bottom, we can see what this VR scenario looked like. It was pretty similar. I mean, the design was pretty much the same. The dialogue was the same. You can see the participants look slightly different, and also the location, the house, but it's the same idea. So in the first person condition, whenever the participant looked down to where the real body would be, they would see the body of a woman. And also whenever they looked into the mirror, which is not completely shown here, but they would see the reflection of a woman who moved synchronously to their real body movements because they were wearing body tracking sensors. And then here on the bottom, we see how the male abuser is approaching the female victim in a threatening manner. And eventually, he gets really close, very close to the face. And also he throws a telephone that's here in the hallway in the direction of the victim. And then on the right side, we see a third person condition. They're just merely observers, right? They see the woman as an outside observer, and also here down, the participant would see the couple interacting, but not being either one of them. So if we start with physiological reactions, we see here's a graph of skin conductance, which is a measure of arousal. Here we chose 2 events of interest. There were 3 events of interest in the whole video, you'll see later. But these 2 events of interest we considered were a bit threatening. One of them is when the man throws the phone towards the victim and when the man is approaching her in a threatening manner. This happens within 10 seconds, so that's why one is going after the other. And so we see that both groups, the ones in the first person condition and the ones who are observers, they both react, they both show arousal, they both show a physiological reaction to both threatening events. And here on the right side, we see the quantification, the area under the curve. And we can see how it's larger for the first person perspective, but this difference did not reach significance. And what's interesting is that the magnitude of the physiological response correlated in all participants with some of the questionnaire items that we asked them in the end. So for example, if the more vulnerable they felt for being a woman, then the greater the magnitude of the skin conductance response. And this second question is whether they found that this VR tool could be used to rehabilitate offenders, and also the more they thought so, the stronger the skin conductance reaction. Okay, so this is quite interesting because we see that it's not only a matter of perspective, but maybe it has more to do with how identified or how inside the VR scene they felt, so that they had a higher skin conductance response. Here we see behavior. Here on the bottom, we see the 3 events of interest. So let's say the ones that could potentially induce more behavioral and physiological reactions. And in black, we see the behavioral responses in the first person condition, which tends to be higher. So this is showing the percentage of participants in each group who showed some sort of behavioral reaction. Okay, this is a very coarse analysis, but we did much deeper analysis, but for the sake of time, I'm going to skip that. And then here on the left, we see that almost 70% of participants in the first person condition, so who were being the victim, spontaneously spoke with the avatar. So this is quite interesting, right? Because nobody told them to speak to them. They still knew they were in VR. However, they still talked to him, almost 70%. That's a pretty high number of people. And this might be related to the fact that participants in the first person condition considered that they could be assaulted, physically assaulted, to a greater extent than did those who were observers. And they also took the scene more personally than those as observers. And finally, this is, I'm going to show you just a couple of things from the interview. So participant in the first person condition reported feeling in a state of alert, more than threatened, and uncomfortable for not being able to keep a distance with the offender who kept approaching them. And those in the third person condition reported not having a threatening sensation, but they did feel uncertainty and some fear to the unknown or to what could happen. In terms of feelings, here down we see those in the victim shoes reported rage, powerlessness, insecurity, vulnerability, fear, nervousness, and tension. So pretty much feelings reminiscent of what a victim would feel likely in such a situation. And those in the third person condition reported more general state of anxiety. So taking into account what we've talked about, the physiological reactions, the behavioral responses, the interview and everything, we concluded that even though the first person perspective facilitated taking the scene personally and generated a sensation of fear, helplessness, and vulnerability, also tended to induce greater in behavioral and physiological reactions, it seems that the potential for batterer rehabilitation originates from presence and identification with the victim, which in turn is more easily but not exclusively achieved through one person perspective. So pretty much if in order to facilitate this sensation of presence, of being in VR, of identifying with the victim, identifying with the situation, then this is more easily achieved through experiencing the scene from a first person perspective, but it's not exclusive, okay? Those in the third person perspective, some of them also had higher levels of presence and identification, and also great, like pretty big physiological and behavioral responses. So that's it for now. Thanks a lot.